Is the war in Gaza about security or about power and survival in collapsing regional order? Is Gaza a conflict the world wants to solve or one it has learned to accept as permanent?
So expulsion is an ongoing process that occupies the energies and the resources and the money and the weapons and the landmines of the Israeli state every minute of every day for the past 78 years.
I don't think it meets the definition of genocide. It doesn't matter what international law says. What matters is the dictionary. Look at the word genocide in a dictionary.
There is no healthy conversation when it comes to Israel. Point. That's the politics. New normal now.
From Lisbon, Frontlines and Backrooms podcast. Your host, Vladimir Bobatic.
Gaza is most often described as a war about security, about borders, rockets, and the right to self-defense. But the war in Gaza is also unfolding inside a much larger story, one shaped by power, survival, and the regional order that has been quietly collapsing for years. This conflict does not exist in isolation. It is embedded in the Middle East, defined by shifting alliances, authoritarian stability, and growing international preferences for managing crises rather than resolving them. Over time, Gaza has become something more than a battlefield. It has become a condition, recurring, contained, and increasingly normalized. Its violence follows familiar patterns. Its civilian toll is tragically predictable. And its political horizon appears narrower with every escalation. There is no understanding of this complexity without knowledge of history. We began with Professor Zachary Foster. Professor, before 1948, Zionism wasn't a single unified project. There were cultural, political, religious, and even anti-state Zionists. Which of these internal Zionists' debates do you think were mostly decisive in shaping what actually happened in 1948?
There were many Zionist debates within the Zionist community. And I would say perhaps one of the most important of those debates was this question around the Arab question. That's what it was called. You have already going back to the 1880s and 1890s, in the very earliest period of Zionist colonization, you have Zionists buying up land from absentee landlords, arriving at the land, and then evicting the inhabitants of that land, the tenant farmers living on that land, because they were Palestinian Arab. They had the wrong religion. The Zionists wanted to till the soil themselves. They wanted to own the land themselves. They wanted to cultivate the crops themselves. And so the fact that there were Palestinian Arabs living on that land posed a problem. And so the question that every Zionist leader asked themselves from the 1890s, that's when Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism, asked himself the question, going on down to Israel Zangwill in the first decade of the 20th century, going on down to Moshe Smolansky and Arthur Rupin in the 1910s and 1920s, Chaim Weizmann in 1930, David Ben-Gurion in 1937, Yosef Weitz, Zev Jabotinsky, they all asked the same question, which is, how are we going to establish a Jewish state in a country that is 95% Palestinian Arab in 1880, that is 90% Palestinian Arab in 1920, that is 80% Palestinian Arab in 1930, that is 75% Palestinian Arab in 1940, and even by 1947, on the eve of the 1948 war and the establishment of the State of Israel, Palestine is still 2/3 Palestinian Arab. So how is it that you establish a Jewish state in a country that's overwhelmingly Palestinian? Not just establish a Jewish state, but establish a Jewish state with a Jewish majority in which Jews own all of the businesses, Jews control the government, they operate, they occupy the rank and file of the of the Zionist executive, that is to say, the rank and file of the government. And so how do you establish a Jewish state in 1947 when most of the people living in the country that you want to establish a Jewish state in are Palestinian Arab? And so there were so many debates about this. And I think the Zionists ideally had hoped that the Palestinians would voluntarily leave. That was the goal. They understood that if you try to expel them, that will lead to blowback, that violence breeds violence, that if you expel people, you yourself will face violence in response to your attempt to expel them. So they didn't want to necessarily expel them, but they also understood that these people consider themselves the native inhabitants of the land. Zev Jabotinsky, the revisionist Zionist leader, who was the intellectual bearer to the Likud party, the current party of the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. So he, in 1923, publishes this tract in which he says the Palestinian Arabs, he called the tract the Iron Wall. And he basically says it very directly, very clearly, without any ambiguity. The Palestinian Arabs consider themselves the native inhabitants of the land. They have a strong connection to the land, and they consider the Zionist settlers foreign invaders. And he said they're not going to leave. They're not going to give up their land. That's their means of livelihood. You can't compel someone to voluntarily give up their means of livelihood. I mean, 75% of Palestine's inhabitants were farmers. They lived off the fruit of the land. They cultivated wheat and barley in the winter. They cultivated fruits and vegetables and legumes in the summertime, and they cultivated olives in the fall. So if you remove them from their land and uproot them from their land, they have no means of livelihood. They will starve. They will die from not having any means of subsistence. And so the Zionist leaders just debated, and how are we going to do it? Well, hopefully they'll leave on their own, but maybe we can compel them to leave. Maybe we can buy up land for them in Transjordan, which is what Chaim Weizmann suggested in 1930. He made a proposal to the British in 1930. He said, what if we transfer 90,000 Palestinian Arabs to Transjordan? And by the way, it wasn't just the Zionists that thought transfer was the desirable solution here. It was also the British who, in 1937, in the Peel Commission, this commission that set out to understand the causes of the violence. Recall that in 1936, Palestinian Arabs rose up in one of the largest anti-colonial revolts in all of colonial history. And the British are trying to figure out what happened, what went wrong. And they understand that Zionist land purchases and the Zionist colonization of Palestine is driving Palestinians off their lands. They become landless peasants living in Haifa, living in Jaffa, no work, and they're attracted to these militias and these, for example, the militia run by Izzeddin al-Qassam. They're attracted to his militia, and that is ultimately the source of the violence. It's Palestinians get uprooted, and they have no means of livelihood, and they resist. And so the question that most Zionist leaders ask themselves is, how are we going to establish a Jewish state in a land of mostly non-Jews? And ultimately, they all settled on the same answer, especially by the late 40s. It was very obvious what needed to happen. And that's exactly what did happen in 1948.
The debates within Zionism did not end in 1948. They shaped not only how the State of Israel was formed, but also how the moment has been interpreted, justified, and contested ever since. Few historians have influenced that debate more than Benny Morris. His work focuses not on intentions, but on outcomes, and how the events of 1948 continue to define the conflict today. Professor, your archival research suggests that the Palestinian refugee crisis in 1948 had multiple causes rather than a single explanation. To what extent, based on your findings, was the displacement driven by the chaos of war, and to what extent by deliberate expulsion carried out by Israeli forces? In your view, which of these factors was more decisive?
Well, I would say there are three factors. If you want to break it down, there were three factors which basically gave rise to the Palestinian refugee problem, which saw 700,000 out of 1.2 million Palestinians uprooted from their homes, most of them ending up in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which are, of course, part of Palestine. So they weren't really driven out of the country, but remained in another part of the country. But there were three factors. The first factor was the war itself, as you suggested, the chaos of war and the fear of being overrun by Zionist forces, the fear of Zionist atrocities against them, the fear of life under Jewish rule not being particularly pleasant for the Arabs. That's how they felt about it. And so that was the major drive among the Palestinians for leaving. Encroaching war and the fear of the future, perhaps under Jewish rule. The second factor, I would say, was um, instructions, orders by local Arabs, Arab leaders, and Arab commanders to particular communities to leave in face of Jewish advances, in face of Jewish encroachment, or orders by local Arabs to women and children to depart, to leave the men to fight the advancing Israelis without having to worry about women and children at their back. So this departure by Arab villagers occurred a lot in the coastal plain, in the valleys, in the Galilee, and departure by women and children, even from places like Haifa, where they were sent off to Lebanon in buses. This was a second factor. The third factor was expulsion by Jewish troops. In other words, Jewish troops arrived in a town or village, conquered it, and then told the population which had remained in place to leave within 10 hours, within 48 hours, whatever. And people left. Those are the three factors. But of the three, the most important was the chaos and fear of encroaching battle and the war itself. You could say that in a sense, as a result of the war, the Arabs who became refugees, most of them were driven out. In some way, it was Jewish advances, military successes, and so on, which led them to flee. But it's not the same, it's not tantamount to expulsion. The majority just fled out of fear. A small number fled as a result of expulsion. In other words, were driven out physically at the point of the bayonet. And a small number left as a result of orders by their local leaders, the local commanders, and so on.
For Palestinians, 1948 is not only a historical turning point, it is a collective memory, one that continues to shape identity, loss, and displacement across generations. The Nakba left scars that were never allowed to heal. Understanding how it happened and how quickly it unfolded is essential to understanding Gaza today. Professor Foster, you mentioned several ideas that were contemplated by Zionist leaders about how to acquire the land, including the hope that Palestinians would leave voluntarily or that land could be purchased elsewhere, including in Jordan. None of those scenarios materialized. Instead, the result was the Nakba, what some Israeli historians actually describe as ethnic cleansing. How and why did events move so quickly toward that outcome?
By 1947, when the United Nations called for the partition of Palestine in the infamous partition plan of November 1947, the Zionist leadership was preparing itself for statehood. They understood that statehood was on the horizon. I mean, this was the case already going back to the Biltmore platform in 1942, I believe, 1943, in which the Zionist movement declared very clearly its goal was to establish a Jewish state. This rhetoric around a Jewish national home that you see in the Balfour Declaration, no one was pretending anymore. The goal was a state. And if the goal was a state, then the question was, how do you secure its borders? How do you ensure that there's a majority of Jews in the state? And the partition plan itself called for a Jewish state and an Arab state. And in the Jewish state, there would be roughly half Jews, half Palestinians. It would be a razor-thin majority of Jews in the so-called Jewish state. But that was unacceptable. And if you read the writings of the Zionist leaders of Moshe Sharet and David Ben-Gurion and Yosef Weitz and Vladimir Jabotinsky, they talk about trying to secure a Jewish majority of 70, 80%. Actually, that was the figure that Ben-Gurion cited in his writings. 80%. That's how you establish a Jewish state. You need 80% of the state to be Jews. But only 55% of the state was Jewish, according to the partition plan. And even the partition plan's borders were themselves totally unacceptable to the Zionists. And that's why they went on a military offensive in January, February, and March 1948. And in March 1948, they call for they adopt this plan known as Plan Dalet, which is effectively a blueprint for cleansing Palestine of its Arabs. And they go village to village, really beginning in March, April, and May. They depopulate hundreds of villages, and they expel by force already before, this is long before May 1948 when the Arab armies invade, already maybe 400,000, perhaps more Palestinians had already been, they either left on their own because there's a war and who want to get caught in the crossfire, or they were expelled by force, or they left out of fear of being expelled. And that was the case for about 400,000 Palestinians by May 1948. You have a document in the Zionist archives dating to June 1948, in which the Zionist community in Palestine, now we can call it the State of Israel, lists out all the reasons for flight, right? That's how they call it. And the top three reasons are Zionist military maneuvers, or the result of Zionist military maneuvers, or direct Zionist forcible expulsions. They're basically saying outright, the reason Palestinians are leaving is because we're expelling them. And that was the case in June 1948. And then it got worse after, because by the late summer and early fall 1948, you already have a state. It's already been recognized by the United States and the Soviet Union. So you're at this point expelling Palestinian Arabs for the sole purpose of increasing the percentage of people in the state that will be Jewish and to expand the country's borders. And that was what happened in the fall of 1948 when the Israeli government was unsatisfied with its borders. It wanted to expand them. So it continued to push forward both in the south and the north. And so you get battles in the north, like the Battle of Hiram in the north, in which the Zionist forces expel another 150,000 Palestinians from towns and villages in the Galilee. I mean, this is after the state's already been accepted as a member of the international community by the United States and the Soviet Union, and they're just pushing forward. And they push forward in the south too. And Beersheba is ethnically cleansed in October, November 1948, and they push forward into the south, and they actually try conquering Gaza. And they almost achieve it, save for an American ambassador who, in December 1948, writes to the United States and says Israel is trying to conquer Gaza and push more Palestinians out of Gaza. And the U.S. President at the time, I believe it's Harry S. Truman, basically says, no, we're not going to allow this, and basically calls an end to the war, at least in the South. And so by the end of 1948, you have something like 500 Palestinian villages emptied of their native inhabitants. You have a Jewish state now with something like 650,000 Jews, 150,000 Arabs. So they've achieved that 75, 80% goal. You have 750,000 Palestinians living in refugee camps in Jordan, in the West Bank, which was occupied by Jordan, and Gaza, which was occupied by Egypt and Lebanon and Syria. And this is really the beginning of how we wound up in the mess we wound up into today.
The word Nakba means a disaster. And what befell the Palestinians as a result of the war they themselves launched very foolishly because they didn't understand the balance of power. As a result, the Palestinian society collapsed. And the major expression of that collapse was the uprooting of 700,000 Arabs from their homes. Well, if you want to call it voluntarily, if you want to call it as a result of the war, if you want to call it as a result of expulsion, but that's what happened. And all of that together is an enormous disaster, which the Palestinians called the Nakba. The war in 48 between a very small Jewish Zionist society of 650,000 people versus twice the number of Arabs in Palestine versus tens of millions of Arabs in the surrounding Arab states also put in danger, in great danger, the Jewish community in Palestine. The difference was that the Jewish community stood up, stood straight, rallied around the flag, fought as they should fight, and fought well, while the Arabs basically collapsed. Arab society, Palestinian society was not ready for what they had launched, for the war which they had launched, where it didn't have shelters, didn't have bomb shelters, didn't have proper equipment, didn't have an organized militia, national militia, and they collapsed as a result of this defeat in war. The Jews held out and survived and, if you like, prevailed.
In a 2004 interview to Haaretz, you said that under certain circumstances, ethnic cleansing can be justified, but later saying that this statement was taken out of context. Can you explain the context in which you made that argument and what you actually meant by it?
I was quite clear in the interview itself. I did give the context. In 1948, the Jews in Palestine feared 3 years after the Holocaust that they faced a second Holocaust at the hands of the Arabs who were attacking the Zionist Jewish community in Palestine. And in that situation and with that mindset, if you want to win the war and avoid a second Holocaust of the Jews, you are justified in throwing out Arabs from Palestine who are trying to kill you. It's as simple as that. It's self-defense. And that's how I understood it. And it's probably true that without a large-scale departure of Arabs from the area of the emergent state of Israel, a state of Israel or a stable state of Israel would never have come into existence.
You have described David Ben-Gurion as a major ethnic cleanser who didn't finish the job. Uh, were you suggesting that Israel's founding involved actually ethnic cleansing, or is that interpretation is inaccurate as well?
I've always said that there was a partial ethnic cleansing in 48. Partial in the sense that ethnic cleansing usually means governmental policy of throwing out the people, driving them out. I think the policy wasn't like that. The policy was simply to wage war. And as a result of waging the war, and as a side, a byproduct of waging war, there was also a departure or uprooting of Arab communities. In some places, there was expulsions, and those, I would say, would be part of an ethnic cleansing strategy. But that wasn't the grand strategy adopted by the Jewish state in 48. It just happened. There was a war. Many Arabs fled of their own volition as a result of the war, under a threat, if you like, of a Jewish attack, etc. But some Arabs left as a result of expulsion, but others, as I say, left as a result of Arab initiatives to leave certain areas. So the word ethnic cleansing for the whole of what happened in 48, I don't think would be right, because it sounds like what the Serbs did in, I don't know, Bosnia or Croatia, etc., which was organized policy of eviction. That wasn't what happened in 48. But perhaps had the Jews, perhaps had Israel done a more thorough uprooting of Palestinians from the area of the state of Israel and probably from the West Bank, the problem would have been much simpler to solve between Israel and the Arab world, I think.
The question then is not only what happened in 1948, but what kind of state emerged from those processes. To what extent was the Israel we know today built through the displacement of Palestinians?
Of course. I mean, I would even say the ethnic cleansing began long before 1948. Because recall, as we said, that when Zionists bought up land in Palestine from the 1880s onwards, they evicted the native inhabitants of that land because they weren't Jewish. And so already in 1896, the Zionist community buys up land in the Galilee. This is in the Galilee, in Metula, what is today the Israeli town of Metula, and they expel 600 Jews. 600 Jews. And for the next year or two, you get these constant attacks of Druze, of farmers trying to graze their flocks on land, and Zionist forces pushing them off. And so the expulsions and the evictions began in the 1880s and 1890s. And then in the 1920s, they dramatically accelerated the process of pushing Palestinians off their lands. The Zionists buy up a huge swath of land in the Jezreel Valley in the 1920s from absentee landlords, the Sarsouk family in Beirut. And they expel thousands and thousands of Palestinian farmers in the north, in the Jezreel Valley, who many of whom wind up in Haifa and join Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam's militia that eventually rises up and carries out that revolt against the British that we mentioned from 1936 to 1939. And then, of course, the process continues into the 1940s. You have what was known as the Tower and Stockade method. This was a Zionist approach to trying to conquer land in British Mandatory Palestine and establish new Jewish settlements in British Mandatory Palestine in 1943. There's an effort, and they take over 11 points in the southern desert in 1946. So you have all these attempts of, and when they do that, they clash with native inhabitants living in these areas, many of whom are either leave or are pushed out, or whose livelihoods are threatened when Zionists take over land. So this was a process that began in the 1890s and continued more or less continuously until 1948. And there's something very important David Ben-Gurion says in 1937. He's the leader of the Zionist community in Palestine, the first prime minister of the state of Israel. In 1937, when the Peel Commission proposes to transfer Arabs out of the Jewish state, David Ben-Gurion says, well, sure, this is normal and natural. This is exactly what we've been doing. So for the leaders of the Zionist community, what happened in 48 was a mere extension of what had already been happening. Sure, in the previous 60 years, we bought the land and then evicted the people living on it. But in 1948, we don't even have to buy the land. We take the land by force because the British are gone. And so we don't need to buy the land. We can take the land through force. And so that's exactly what they do. But for them, it's the same general. There's nothing fundamentally different about buying the land and evicting the Palestinians living on it, which happens before 48, or taking over the land by force and evicting the Palestinians living on it. It's fundamentally the same thing. So at the root of the Zionist project is the need to own the land. If you don't own the land, you're not going to be able to build a state in the land. You're not going to be able to till the soil or cultivate the crops or own the factories because you don't own any land. So you need to own the land. You need to own the labor as well. This was the Zionist concept of Hebrew labor. And so throughout the 1920s and 30s, there was a push within the Zionist community to purge Arabs from working in Jewish-owned cooperatives, in these Zionist cooperatives that were owned by the Zionist community. They wanted to purge Arabs, and they did so violently throughout the 1920s and 30s. And so, yes, the ethnic cleansing was at the root of the Zionist project from its origins all the way to the present day.
Professor Morris, from your perspective as a historian, which moments were truly decisive in shaping the conflict as it exists today? Was it the events of 1948, the occupation after 1967, the Oslo process, or what followed? If you had to identify the turning point that made the conflict permanent, which would they be?
Well, certainly 1948 is the place where we should begin, and 1967 is a second major milestone. 1947 led to there was a war which the Arabs began against the Jewish community in Palestine. The Jews beat the Palestinian Arabs in that war, and then subsequently beat the Arab armies which invaded the country in May 1948 in support of the Palestinians. Israel beat them. The state of Israel was established, created in certain borders, and by 1949, the Arab states had given up. The Palestinians were nowhere around in the sense of the politics of the region. They were dispersed in large measure as refugees around the area of the state of Israel. The state of Israel basically flourished since then. That in itself, of course, being a major reason why the Arabs hated and continue to hate Israel. It is a successful country as compared to the Arab states, Iraq, Sudan, Syria, Yemen, you name them, civil wars, disastrous governments, dictatorships, no rights, no water, no industry, poor agriculture. These are the Arab states basically today, save for, of course, the very oil-rich states in the Gulf, which are successful not because of any great human achievements, but because of the oil under the ground.
Gaza is often spoken about as though it has always existed within the borders we know today. In reality, Gaza was once a city, and what became Gaza as a territory was shaped by the mass displacement of Palestinians after 1948. Refugees from the north and from the areas that became Israel were pushed into a narrow strip along the coast. Some historians argue that Gaza's borders are largely a historical accident, the result of the 1949 armistice lines. Do you agree with that assessment, and how did that accident go on to shape the next 75 years of life in Gaza?
That's correct. the phrase Gaza Strip does not exist in the English language before 1948. There is no Gaza Strip. There's Gaza City. That's a city. There's Rafah. There's Khan Yunis. But then what happens in 1948 is that the fighting ends, and the armistice line that is signed between Israel and Egypt in the aftermath of that war is what we now know is the Green Line, that the line separating Gaza and Israel. But it's effectively where the front line was at the end of the fighting. And like we said, Israel actually wanted to take over the Gaza Strip, but they failed to. There were many battles between Egyptian forces and Zionist and Israeli forces in 48. And although the Zionists were able to push forward south, right? If you look at the partition plan, Gaza's the Gaza Strip, let's call it. I mean, it's not known as that, but the area along the coastal plain in the southern part of Palestine is much, much larger in the partition plan of 48 than it is in the aftermath of the war. So the Zionists pushed forward. They pushed Egyptian forces south, but they failed to conquer it all. And so this area, but what did they do? They pushed Palestinians into it. So it became a warehouse for surplus humans who were unwanted because they had the wrong ethnicity and the wrong religion. And so you get about 250,000 Palestinians wind up in the Gaza Strip, in addition to the 70,000 or so Palestinians who had already been living there. So already in 1948, 2/3, 70% of the Gaza Strip is refugees from the surrounding towns and the surrounding cities and the surrounding villages. And many of the Palestinians living into 70%, what are the numbers? 80% of people living in the Gaza Strip today are descendants of those refugees, who, when they look out into Israel, into the quote unquote Gaza envelope, they can literally see the villages from which they came, including, by the way, the founder of the organization that later became known as Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. He was 13 years old. I believe he was born in, I think, Juba was the name of the city. It's a town 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers outside of the Gaza Strip. And when he was 13 years old, he was violently expelled from his home, and he wound up in the Gaza Strip, as did many other resistance leaders. I mean, this is why Gaza became such a center of resistance, because these people were all violently ethnically cleansed from their homes and forced into these refugee camps in squalid conditions. And in the 1950s, you have ambassadors and diplomats visiting the Gaza Strip, likening it to a concentration camp. And that's how the Gaza Strip came into existence, as a place where Israel got to push all these Palestinian refugees into. And then they built landmines around the Strip. And you have reports in the 1949 and 1950 of all these Palestinians actually trying to return to their homes that they were violently uprooted from, to reclaim property, to see lost family, to reclaim their lives that they were and their homes and their properties. And many of them were killed crossing those armistice lines. They were killed by landmines that Israel put there to prevent Palestinians from returning to their homes. And I think if you think about the essence of the Zionist enterprise, people oftentimes describe expulsion as an event, but it's not an event. Expulsion is something that is ongoing, because expulsion is not a one-time thing. Because if you just treat it as a one-time thing, then they could come back. So expulsion is an ongoing process that occupies the energies and the resources and the money and the weapons and the landmines of the Israeli state every minute of every day for the past 78 years. Because it's not just expelling them once. You have to make sure they are forever expelled and never come back. And that is why expulsion, it lies at the core of the enterprise of the Israeli state.
These interpretations raise one of the most sensitive questions at the heart of the conflict about history, responsibility, and moral burden. Professor Morris, many Palestinians argue that they were asked to pay the price for the Holocaust by losing their land to create a state for European Jews. How do you respond to that argument?
It's complicated. I mean, the answer is necessarily morally ambiguous and complicated. Firstly, I would say, and this the Arabs always forget to mention, that the Arabs, by and large, in Palestine and outside Palestine, supported the Germans in World War II. They supported an Axis victory, not an Allied victory. They were against the British. Not some of them because they were anti-Semites, some of them because of the Jews, the Zionist enterprise in Palestine, and many of them, most of them, because they saw the British as colonial imperialists who were crushing their own nationalist dreams and endeavors. But they supported the Germans, the Axis powers in World War II. Secondly, the leader of the Palestinian national movement through the 30s until 1948, in fact, was a man called Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem. He had mass support both in the Arab world but also among the Palestinians, and he was a Nazi collaborator. He, after the Arab Revolt, during the Arab Revolt against the British in the 30s, he fled eventually to Berlin and worked for the Nazis, doing propaganda against the British, raising troops for the SS and for the Wehrmacht. He was a Nazi, basically an official paid with a salary from the German Foreign Office. And apparently supported also the Holocaust itself, though here the evidence is not that clear. Not that he was against the Holocaust, but there's not that much linkage between him and what was actually happening in the death camps. But he knew of what was happening and he supported it. That's fairly clear. So these points are also important in understanding. But then when you look at the grand picture, it is true the Holocaust was a major driving force in the persuasion of the Western powers, meaning the Americans and even British public opinion, Scandinavia, France, and so on, a major driving force in their support eventually for Jewish statehood in the UN vote in 1947 and through the 48 war. So the Holocaust was very important in this sense. And if you like, as a result of what happened during the 48 war, the Jews displaced many of the Palestinians, crushed Palestinian nationalist aims, ambitions. And in this sense, the Holocaust, which Europeans or Germans plus their assistants committed in Europe, ended up helping to create the Jewish state. And this was at the expense of the Palestinians. So they were right in this sense. But I say you can't completely deny some Palestinian role in what happened, because in the late 30s, the Palestinian Arab revolt against the British, as I said, there's the business of the Mufti and the Arab support for the war, the German war effort in World War II. But there's one greater responsibility, which everybody forgets to mention, and that is that the Arab revolt was, if you like, generated by growing European Jewish emigration from Europe, people trying to get out of Europe away from the Holocaust, which was about to happen, and get to Palestine. The Arab revolt forced the British to close the gates of Palestine to these Jewish survivors or emigrants from Europe, and left many Jews stranded in Europe, who eventually were killed by the German Holocaust machine. So, in other words, the Arab revolt, which forced the British to close the gates of Palestine to Jewish entry into Palestine, in an indirect way, led to the death of lots of Jews, hundreds of thousands, millions. One can't give it a number, but led to this because the gates of Palestine were closed to Jews by the British under pressure from the Arabs. Now, the Arabs, of course, when they were rebelling against the British, didn't know that the Jews of Europe were about to die, 6 million of them. They couldn't know that. But they did know that Europe had turned against the Jews. There was a great deal of anti-Semitism. Germany was gradually enacting laws and various measures against the Jews. And as I say, the Arabs nonetheless attacked the Jews, but also attacked the British, forcing the British to close Palestine to Jewish emigrants from Europe. In this sense, the Arabs were responsible in some way for the Holocaust, which, as they say, eventually led to Jewish statehood, which also led to their collapse and depopulation in terms of Palestine.
It is important to clarify the historical record here. At the time of the Second World War, Palestine was a province of the British Empire under the League of Nations mandate system. There was no mass Palestinian revolt in support of Nazi Germany. On the contrary, many Palestinians volunteered to fight with Allied forces against the Axis. The support of Nazi Germany by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, does not represent the views or actions of the Palestinian population. Al-Husseini was appointed by British authorities, later removed from power, and eventually fled Palestine, acting in exile without a popular mandate. History explains how Gaza was shaped. Power explains why it remains trapped. But none of that captures what it means to live there. For that, we turn to journalist Nadina Malicbegović, who has reported from Gaza and West Bank and witnessed how these forces are experienced by ordinary people. Nadina, when you talk about Gaza today, what is the first image, memory, or person that comes to your mind?
In 2020, after spending several days in Gaza, we were living through the Erez crossing, the main border crossing between Gaza Strip and Israel. A young Palestinian woman walked past us, uh, carrying a clearly sick baby who was crying the whole time. The Israeli border officer made her go back several times for inspection while she held her baby in one arm and tried to gather her scattered belongings with the other. They were rude and insolent to her without caring that her baby was not in good health. It was obvious she was not in good health. Soon I realized that she was on her way out of Gaza for urgent medical treatment for her baby, something that is rarely possible for Palestinians living under the blockade. I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by sorrow as I watched her fighting for her child, knowing how many others never get this chance. I can't remember the woman's face or the baby's, but I can still hear the baby crying in my mind. And that was the first time I visited Gaza. Then I returned in November 2022, and then October 7 happened. All that images I had, they were also beautiful ones, disappeared after I saw Muhammad, a little child shaking with fear in a hospital. He had been asleep, but the sounds of Israeli bombardment woke him, and his tiny body trembled with terror. That was the start of what the world's leading human rights organizations now recognize as genocide.
While reporting from Gaza, you became friends with two young men. One of them, Mohammed, was killed early in this war. If you feel comfortable, could you tell us about them and what the friendship meant to you?
No problem, Vlado. I first met Mohammed and Yusuf in 2020. A friend from Jerusalem had connected us in case we needed help with filming in Gaza. Mohammed was a photographer. Yusuf is a filmmaker. They helped us find people to talk to for a story about the blockade, asking for nothing in return. After filming, we would sit for hours talking. Mohammed shared his dreams and fears. He loved Gaza, but hated the prison it had become. He was very young, I think in his 20s. Like most residents, he couldn't leave. He dreamed of freedom. I remember his eyes lighting up when my colleague talked about football, about Barcelona, Real Madrid, Messi, Ronaldo. And actually, it wasn't about the game. It wasn't about the question, who is the GOAT? It was about the idea of freedom, the chance to go anywhere, to live fully. We stayed in touch after I left. 2 years later, I visited again, less than a year before October 7, and I met Mohammed for coffee. On my last day, he wanted to meet again, to give me, as he said, a small gift, something his sister has made for me. But unfortunately, because of Israeli restrictions, we had to leave and we never saw each other again. Mohammed was killed at the start of the war while waiting for humanitarian aid. His family was hungry. One message from March 16, 2024 still haunts me. Mohammed, tell me you are okay, please. And there was no answer.
Before this war, Gaza was often reduced to headlines, rockets, militants, and violence. When you were there, did you experience Gaza primarily as a place of conflict or as a place where people were simply trying to live their lives?
Yes, of course. Life in Gaza was incredibly hard. It was full of restrictions, suffering, and injustice. Children walked barefoot because their parents couldn't afford shoes. Families had to choose between food and school supplies, and shelling was frequent. Yet people still found ways to be happy. They laughed, teased each other, and celebrated small moments. There was a constant fight to preserve dignity, and they did it actually. What the world keeps missing is their humanity, their longing for safety, for freedom, for better future. Actually, Palestinians in Gaza are not just headlines or casualties. They are human beings who deserve the same rights we all take for granted. Actually, what I wanted to say, Gaza has been under occupation for so long that the world got used to it, but it shouldn't. These are real human beings with humor, uh, with talent, with ordinary dreams. Their lives are not defined by war. War was forced on them.
Gaza was often described as an open air prison. What did that mean in everyday practical terms?
Yes, it was an open air prison, and that wasn't a metaphor. It was a reality, actually. The land, air, and sea blockade shaped every part of daily life of Palestinians. People often had only about 8 hours of electricity a day, for example. Internet was restricted and controlled by Israel. And Israel also controlled everything that entered or left Gaza. Poverty was widespread. 2.3 million people were confined to a very small piece of land, surrounded by walls, by fences, watchovers, drones. They couldn't live freely. You couldn't just decide to travel, to study abroad, to visit family, or even to get medical treatment outside Gaza. Israel controlled every aspect of life in Gaza. People were living with constant uncertainty. One morning, for example, you would wake up and hear that a neighborhood had been shelled, two, three, five, or 10 people killed. And by the afternoon, life would continue because it had to. That was the normal. To me, for example, calling it an open air prison simply meant telling the truth. Palestinians in Gaza lived surrounded by walls they didn't build, under rules they didn't choose, without the basic freedom of move, to grow, or to imagine a different future. It was a place full of life and joy, but also full of limits that no human being should ever have to experience.
What the people outside Gaza most often misunderstood about daily life under the blockade, the routines, the limits, and the small moments of normal life.
Yes, actually, the world often misses that Gazans lived both realities at once, joy because they had to, and suffocation because they had no choice. After October 7th, for example, some say, why are they still there if it's so bad? Why don't they leave? Or it's a war, they started it. But that's not true, actually. Uh, Later, I can speak about Palestinians and about how they didn't start the war. But what we have seen before, it was totally blockade on all sides, actually. For example, fishermen couldn't do their job and get the fish because Israel said it's not possible to do because they are threat. And some of them, and we filmed them also during our visit in Gaza, uh, they shooted on them because for Israel it was unaccepted. Uh, People who make sport, for example, they couldn't leave Gaza for tournaments because Israel didn't allow that. They lived in Gaza. It was real open air prison. Uh, they got something to eat, yes, but everything was limited. Everything was what entered Gaza was limited. Everything what needs to exit was limited. Everything was controlled by Israel. And when I say it, I mean all aspects of life for Gazans.
In part 2, we trace the structures, decisions, and interests that turn Gaza into a permanent crisis.
I think the lack of condemnation comes down to politics and narratives. Reporting the human cost of Gaza challenges powerful interests, and journalists are often discredited for simply telling the truth.
I don't see lasting peace happening anytime in my lifetime, and frankly, I don't see it happening anytime in the near future.
Mohammed bin Salman is in bed with Jared Kushner, and he's doesn't care about the Palestinian people. When have you heard Mohammed bin Salman say a single positive thing about the Palestinian people? He hates them for the same reason Abdel Fattah al-Sisi hates them, because they pose an Islamicist threat.
Part 2 drops Monday, December 15th at 8 p.m. GMT.